This week on the Al-Masdar Podcast, Brad Blankenship talks to Dr. Max Abrahms on his theory of terrorism that is significantly different from the standard model. Also joining us this week is documentary filmmaker Mojtaba Masood to offer his insights in their discussion. Enjoy the show.
So, Max, I want to talk about your theory of terrorism. I was reading your article in the Harvard Business Review, and you mentioned the correspondent interference, or inference theory, rather, explains a cognitive process by which an observer infers the motives of an actor. Edward Jones, who wrote this theory, described everybody as naive psychologists. How do you think that plays into terrorism? Because obviously the theories right now seem to be fairly intuitive. I mean, they seem to be pretty obvious, but you posit a different theory of terrorism. So I'd like to speak a little to those points.
Well, terrorism is quite complicated, and observers almost make it seem as if it's much simpler, and that there's a single motivation for terrorists, and that even people who know very, very little about the perpetrators very frequently claim to know exactly what the terrorists want. I first noticed this after 9/11. I started studying terrorism around 2000, and, I'd been reading bin Laden's fatwas, for example, to try to understand his group. And right after 9/11, I noticed that all these people who previously had never heard of Al-Qaeda or bin Laden, they came flying out of the woodworks claiming to know exactly why bin Laden authorized this watershed attack against the United States. A cab driver told me, for example, that he wasn't going to be paralyzed by the fear in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, that he wasn't going to stay home. He was going to continue driving people around, because if he stopped, his taxi driving, then Al-Qaeda would have gotten exactly what it wants. And a soccer coach of little kids told me that practice was still on, because if he was paralyzed by fear and canceled soccer practice, Al-Qaeda would have gotten exactly what it wants. And I began thinking, this is, I've read these fatwas a number of times, and bin Laden doesn't talk about taxi cabs or soccer games. So from the beginning, I was very skeptical that, that lay people could somehow know exactly what the terrorists want, even if it's not something that the terrorists themselves express. I noticed right after 9/11, or shortly after, the U.S. would occupy Iraq. And critics said that don't do that, because that's doing exactly what the terrorists want. The following year, in 2004, Spain was attacked, and it withdrew from Iraq. And critics said, don't do that. That's doing exactly what the terrorists want. So regardless of what we do, we're told that that's exactly what the terrorists want. And I began to research why this is. And I came across a social psychological theory developed in the 1970s by a guy named Edward Jones. And the theory is called correspondent inference. And basically what he says is that people are naive psychologists, and that we don't have direct access into the minds of actors. And so we infer their motives based on the observable consequences of their actions. So the example he gives is of a boy who sees his mother get up, walk across the room, and shut the door, which silences the racket coming from outside. The corresponding inference that the boy will likely draw is that his mom got up and shut the door because she wanted the room to be quiet, since that's what the consequences of the behavior were. If the mother were to have gotten up and closed the door and the room became warmer, the boy would have concluded that she got up because she was cold. And so, similarly, people tend to infer the motives of terrorists based on the observable consequences of whatever happens. And so this may or not be true that this is driving the behavior of the terrorists, but this will be the inference that observers draw. And because people tend infer the motives of terrorists directly from the consequences, people almost invariably come to the conclusion that the terrorists are very, very smart, because essentially they're getting what they want. Because no matter how it is that we respond, this is presumed to be what the terrorists had in mind. And so a lot of my research tries to bring terrorism back down to earth and to show that really terrorists are not these masterminds. Every attack need not be called sophisticated. We don't need to call, people who create bombs engineers and whatnot. A lot of the terrorists are actually just idiots.
I had a lot of professors where I go to school, and they'll say something like, well, insanity is not a communicable disease. These terrorists want you to think that they're being irrational. I think that you make a good point that people, and actually, it's actually well documented in psychology that people intuitively, even at a young age, will look for a cause for some unexplained phenomena. I've seen research on that. Mojtaba, you have devoted a lot of time in documentary making. Another complicated part of this as well, people will automatically say, well, Islam, that is the problem with terrorism. That totally explains it. In your documentary, ISIS, Islamic Extremism, you kind of examined that. And, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your findings and what you brought out in that documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a few situations. Number one, I was a student at a school where Jihadi John studied in. He was a year below me, and he was one of the students in the school. And in my documentary, which was focused on ISIS and extremism, I ended up interviewing the person who is now perceived to be the new Jihadi John. So in some way, I've somehow been known the first Jihadi John and spoken to the second. And a lot of what Max says, could be true. It's very difficult to verify based on our interactions with these individuals. On the basis of the documentary itself, the interview focused on Abu Rumaysa, who was someone who supported ISIS publicly in the UK. And the main points he made was something to do with grievance, where he thought the grievance, whether it's perceived or genuine, was the root cause of his reasons to join ISIS, and then became very linked to the ideology. He had a lot of zeal in what he was doing, and he publicly said that he would want to go live there, and eventually he did. After the interview and a few other interviews he did with the mainstream channels, he ended up going to Syria, which is bizarre. On a side note, how the security services can let him leave the UK when he'd already become a public figure, and he still managed to leave to go to Syria. And ultimately, when we kept focusing on the rhetoric by these individuals, it was a lot to do with this utopian solution, this world vision that they believe can somehow, almost act as a fertile ground for their actions, which religiously, morally, ethically, they cannot justify in any other way apart from this utopian solution. And it all links down to what we call Salafi Wahhabism. A lot of what's done, for example, the burning of the Jordanian pilot, was linked to a quote by a scholar by the name of Ibn Taymiyyah. And it was his quote that they used as to legitimize the burning of that Jordanian pilot. And so a lot of it, I think, does link back as to the Wahhabi mentality or the Wahhabi religious ideology. And in that, they use, certain quotes, certain comments, certain interpretations of how they view Islam is to justify their actions. So how they got to that stage is another argument in itself. But the Wahhabi ideology definitely acts as a fertile ground to commit these crimes.
There was an activist, a leader for a activist group in Great Britain, and he said something like, if you treat people like outsiders, they're going to feel like outsiders, and they'll seek acceptance from outside groups. Do you think that is a fair statement about the radicalization of these people that you mentioned?
I mean, without doubt, I think that definitely has a link to it, especially if you become somewhat when you no longer feel that the state is protecting you, or you no longer feel part of the state, and therefore you become accepted by other organizations, by other groups. We've seen a lot of the individuals who've joined ISIS. A lot of them are converts. Who converted for some reason they tend to convert to the extreme spectrum of the religion, and it's the same case with Islam. We have many who have converted, like Abu Rumaysa himself, who I interviewed, was a Hindu, and he came into Islam and converted straight to the extreme end of Salafi Wahhabism. So the idea that things in the country can somewhat alienate you and somewhat other you and make you join organizations, I think is pretty fair. I mean, the Iraq War itself was used as a grievance card for a lot of these charismatic recruiters, those who were trying to somewhat recruit individuals for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They used wars like the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War to use that as a grievance card, as to say, look what they're doing to us, therefore come and join us, they're killing Muslims and so on. And whether it's perceived or genuine, it's actions like that can somewhat help with the recruitment process for many of these organizations, because it allows them to give this othering, whether it's perceived or genuine, to give this othering of Muslims. And just to finish on that point, Dr. Fana Haddad, who's an expert on Iraq, works in Singapore, or Singapore, Malaysia, made a comment in terms of marginalization being based on perception. For example, in Iraq, if you look at individuals living in Basra, let's say a Shia town, a lot of the things they see in terms of governance and unemployment, they blame that directly on corruption. They blame all these issues on the corruption of the government. Whereas Sunni individuals living in Fallujah, for example, will blame the same issues on sectarian politics, and therefore the perception can become an issue of here, can become quite important in terms of seeing it as a grievance because of your sectarian background, or because of your basically othering you, or merely because it's a corruption issue. Two individuals see the same issue, see the same thing as one sees it as sectarian and one sees it as corruption. And so I think even this the perception issue is quite important in how you view things and how you deal with them as individuals.
So conventional wisdom tells us that groups commit acts of terror because it's effective. Max, you mentioned in one of your papers, I think it was for the MIT Press, you mentioned Alan Dershowitz's bestseller, Why Terrorism Works. You've noted that terrorism is, in fact, very ineffective for social change.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm basically a skeptic of the dominant paradigm among understanding terrorism. The dominant paradigm is the grievance model of terrorism. The basic idea is, pretty self-evident, that people turn to terrorism because they have a political grievance, and terrorism offers them the best chance for them to redress their grievances and to pressure governments into making political accommodations, appease them, concessions, etc., so that the terrorists achieve their demands. And I'm deeply skeptical of this view for many reasons. The first is that it's not actually based on a strong empirical foundation. When countries are attacked by terrorism, specifically when non-state actors attack their civilians, governments do not tend to be more politically conciliatory and make concessions in the direction of the terrorists, just the opposite. Governments almost always dig in their political heels. The electorate tends to move to the political right. The executive power tends to become strengthened, more emboldened. And very often you see a military response to the terrorists which actually renders their stated political grievances even more desperate. So, for example, to put that in practical terms, you look at these attacks inside of Turkey, for example, which are being pinned on the PKK or offshoots of the PKK. And let's just assume for a minute that's correct, that an offshoot of the PKK did that. I would strongly caution the perpetrators that doing that is actually deeply counterproductive for the achievement of, concessions by Erdogan inside of Turkey. But that's really just one, anecdotal example that comes to mind. I've really tested this systematically on a large sample of aggrieved groups, and what I found is that, first of all, there's a correlation of groups that use terrorism and political failure. Groups that use terrorism very seldom manage to achieve their strategic demands. And furthermore, when I calculate this, in a regression analysis controlling for other variables, what I find is that all else equal, when aggrieved groups use terrorism by attacking civilians, it actually lowers the chances of government concessions. And so based on my empirical evidence, I do not find much support for the strategic model. Furthermore, let me just bring this into it. Yesterday, I was reading a article by Charles Lister on Syria. And what he was saying is that basically the Syrian population was basically secular, and Assad really cracked down on the population, and it was Assad's brutality which basically convinced large segments of the population to become Islamist. And I tried to think through how that causal mechanism would actually work. And I'm deeply skeptical because I really don't see it. I could understand why, government oppression might convince somebody to become more religious. Furthermore, I don't actually think that model is that useful in terms of prediction. So, for example, there are really two main schools of thought when it comes to the motives of terrorists. One might be understood as what I've been describing as the grievance model, but the other might be understood as the opportunity model, which basically suggests that terrorists gravitate to targets which are easier to strike, and they gravitate to areas where they're more likely to thrive. And I actually think that the opportunity model of terrorism does a much better job of understanding terrorism today, especially Islamic State, than the grievance model. For example, an influx of terrorists heading to Libya. What exactly is Libya's grievance that would attract them? It's not. It's not due to grievance. It's due to opportunity. There's a large power vacuum there. There are many, militants nearby. The borders are very porous. It's in a centralized location. So it's that model does a better job of predicting why Libya is going to be a problem. You look at other areas of the world where Islamic State is taking root, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, etc. These are, places that offer the terrorists a lot of opportunity to thrive. It's not based on grievances. Now, the terrorists, of course, are going to try to make some sort of an ideological or political pitch, saying that, they're going to these areas because of some important political cause. But really, I suspect that their raison d'etre will evolve over time, and it will be based mostly on expedience. My last example I'll give is the attacks in France, the so-called Paris attacks. A lot of people were searching for some sort of hidden symbolic meaning in the targets. But it turned out that almost all of the targets, whether it was a Cambodian cafe with people drinking coffee outside, or a soccer stadium, or just passerbys, all of these targets, not coincidentally, were very close to where the terrorists were residing. And I would posit that emerged the terrorists would have gone after them because, again, the opportunity model does a better job of explaining terror. So, I mean, I think that a lot of people were looking for hidden symbolic, reasons for why the particular targets were attacked. But I don't think that that's the right way to go about doing it. I don't think that Islamic State is very picky about its targeting. I don't think there was a whole lot of symbolism, like the ones in Paris, the fact that people sitting outside of a Cambodian restaurant were struck. That wasn't a symbolic attack. This is a very indiscriminate group. The attacks in San Bernardino, California, that could have been an opportunity than on grievances.
I want to throw something out there to you guys, and hopefully we can kind of deconstruct this. But the grievance model, as far as I can tell, really breaks down when you consider that a huge section of al-Nusra and ISIS fighters are foreign fighters. And actually, I mean, that's pretty much pathological throughout the world when it comes to terrorist groups, especially those two. So that doesn't really add up with the whole grievance model that somehow these people could have been radicalized by attacks by corrupt governments or whatever. And a lot of these people are from other countries.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Perhaps the most prominent exponent of the strategic model is a professor at University of Chicago named Robert Pape. And he basically says that terrorism, especially suicide terrorism, is a response to occupation. That basically terrorism should be understood as a nationalist phenomenon when people are mistreated. And in Robert Pape's world, the terrorists are victims, and they're altruists who are using this tactic to improve the lot of themselves and of the other people who have been oppressed, often by foreign occupation. And yet, when you look at Islamic State, you're quite right. I mean, look at the composition of this group. I don't view Islamic State fighters as victims. I view them as predators. They're traveling to these countries, often, having lived very cushy lives, perhaps, enrolled in a med school in London, for example, and they're seeking out this interaction. If they stayed home, they wouldn't have any, interaction with the group or with oppression. I think that it's a mistake to look at ISIS people as victims. I view them more as predators who themselves have generally not been subject to violent response.
So, Mojtaba, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think when we talk about grievance, even though I agree with many of the points Max makes, I focus more on grievance as a recruitment tool by these let's say groups like ISIS or Al Qaeda. They use certain things that have taken place, for example, or any sort of government action to recruit fighters or to recruit certain individuals, and we hear that in the rhetoric quite a lot. But there is no doubt that opportunity is one of the biggest recruiters of terrorism. As we know, and many people have fled here to go to Syria because of the opportunity there, because of the chaos in Iraq and Syria, and we know that these groups thrive in chaos. So, in the same situation in Libya, where we see them slowly starting to build up the systems, and now in Yemen as well, we see the groups like Al Qaeda gaining more ground around Aden and Taz and so on. So, opportunity is definitely one of the biggest recruiters for these groups. But if we focus on what the narratives are, or the narratives coming from the West, which I kind of sometimes view as double standards. When we look at Iraq, much of the narrative is on political suppression or political oppression, that, a community was marginalized, and as a result, we have a group like ISIS. If we look at the narrative in Syria, where the narrative is focused on the oppression by the government, and that's why we have Al-Qaeda. That's why we have ISIS. They tend to narrow the tone down when it involves countries like Syria or Iraq, or countries that are hostile to them, or any other countries in the Middle East, tend to narrow down the tone of the religious ideology having something to do with it more, and they focus more on the political, the governments have played a part in this. Whereas when we talk about countries in the UK, for example, or the United States, we never hear any sort of narrative that focuses on the mistakes by the government, or it's the governments had played a part in the rise of these groups. They automatically switch on the religious ideology and how the religious ideology is the biggest tool or the biggest problem that we need to deal with. And that's a clear double standard when we talk about terrorism. If we're willing to talk about terrorism in a frank manner, we need to be very clear that whether it's in the UK or whether it's in Syria, you need to be consistent with your narrative. Blaming governments in Syria for terrorism, but then when terrorism comes home, you want to blame things like the religious ideologies. Therefore, I see there's a disingenuous conversation when we speak about terrorism, especially from politicians or even analysts and think tanks who want to give false narratives when talking about the roots of terrorism.
Yeah, I agree with that. One thing that I'll point out, though, is that, terrorists, by their very definition, express or at least are presumed to have some sort of a political aim. Whether it's Islamist or communist or white supremacist. If it wasn't believed that the perpetrators have some sort of a political aim, then it would be it would be coded as another sort of crime, but not terrorism. For it to be terrorism, there needs to be some sort of a presumed political agenda. And so the fact that we're finding that terrorists often express some sort of a political agenda, is entirely unsurprising. And I think that we need to be skeptical sure, politics certainly plays a role for some of the people. I don't think there's a single explanation here. It's very complicated. But I also think that very often perpetrators of terrorism, they almost speak in like an echo chamber where they sort of repeat the political or ideological or religious mantra of the organization in terms of explaining their behavior. So a good test is to look at the actual paths of the people who end up joining these groups before they join. Because once they join, they're going to just, explain their behavior in political terms. But I suspect that many of these people are not actually drawn to the organization from the start for a political goal. I suspect that it has to do with other things. For example, do they have a friend who's been radicalized? Have they met somebody on the internet, who seems to share, related concerns in life? Are they antsy at home? Are they looking to travel? Are they being led by some sort of a handler? These sort of more sort of social, personal, even idiosyncratic aspects may do a better job of predicting who will join up with a group than, say, someone's pre-existing, long-standing commitment to some sort of a political cause. You're right. I mean, a lot of the people who, particularly from the West, who join up with ISIS, they're new to Islam. They're recent converts. They don't know a lot about the religion. They probably have a very limited understanding of international politics.
Well, you posit this leadership structural model, and you say that deficits in leadership promote terror because then the lower level members of the organizations will have more autonomy, which means they can commit acts of violence with more of a free range. And so you question whether, let's say, for example, the decapitation airstrikes, you question whether they increase terrorism not because they produce the grievance and all of that, but because it destabilizes the leadership.
Right. So, my early empirical finding is that when attacks civilian targets it tends to be politically counterproductive. And so that raises what I call the puzzle of terrorism, which is why do militant groups attack civilians if it tends to have productive political effect? And so I basically come up with a model that can help to predict which groups will attack civilians, when, and why. And what I find is that an important predictor has to do with the strength of the leader over the rest of the members in the organization. That specifically, groups led by weaker leaders are more likely to attack civilian targets than groups led by stronger leaders. And the reason why is because there's an inverse relationship between one's position within the terrorist organization and one's incentives for harming civilians. That is to say, those who are at the lower end of the organization, the operatives, have stronger reasons for harming civilians than those at the top. For example, those at the top, the leader of the group, he tends to be older, he tends to be smarter, he tends to have more experience in asymmetric conflict than brand new recruits. And so he tends to have a better understanding that attacking civilians is risky for the organization. Furthermore, those at the bottom, they often commit attacks for personal reasons. For example, to demonstrate that they're committed to the cause or that they're radical. And so it can help their career to attack civilian targets. And so I find all sorts of evidence that this is true, that groups led by weaker leaders are more likely to attack civilians. For example, I've looked at the data on drones, and I've found that when the leader of a militant group is killed in a drone strike and suddenly lower level members are calling the shots, the group is more likely to attack the population. It's more likely to attack markets and movie theaters, educational centers, than when the leadership is still intact. And operatives travel further away from the leadership, presumably weakening the leader's influence over the operative is more likely to attack civilians. I also find that highly decentralized groups are more likely than centralized groups to attack civilians because, again, the leadership has to delegate more tactical autonomy to lower level members. And so I basically have an organizational explanation which can help to explain the kinds of groups that are more likely to attack civilian targets than others.
I want to ask this question to both of you guys. I think this is a point that I don't think is discussed enough. But when we're talking about terrorism, who defines that and why? I think that's probably a fair question because if you look, historically, you might actually consider somebody like George Washington a terrorist because they committed acts of violence for a political cause. But in a more contemporary sense, the United States right now, let's say, is attempting, I think the Senate is attempting to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And of course, many groups around the world have already done so. And the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, recently designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. So I guess just to both of you guys, because Mojtaba, you remembered, or you brought up the double standard. Who defines what is terrorism, and is that in of itself also a political agenda or a political cause?
Well, it's no doubt a political cause, depending on who you're speaking to. For example, if you look at Turkey and Erdogan's opinion, he had no problem with ISIS being on the border, but as soon as the Kurds got closer, you see him bringing out threats that he's going to do this and that, mainly because he views the Kurds, or specifically the PKK and other affiliates, as a bigger threat to Turkey, and therefore he identifies them as the terrorist threat. If you're looking at, for example, Saudi Arabia, they see groups like Hezbollah, as you said, or countries in the GCC as the terrorist organization or the fundamental threat, as well as Iran, and therefore you start noticing that terrorism becomes very subjective. Everyone views terrorism based on who their main enemy is. And just on a subtopic, I believe this is a bigger problem when we're fighting ISIS as a universal common enemy, because every other organization or every other group or every other country sees ISIS as the secondary enemy. For example, we could say that Iran sees Saudi as the enemy, or they see the rebel groups in Syria as the enemy, whereas Assad also sees groups in Syria as also the primary enemy in defeating them, because they pose a greater threat to his existence. We see Turkey, as I said, who view the PKK as a threat and the real terror threat to them. And so you start observing that terrorism becomes subjective to those who are speaking about it, and that's why I think it's very difficult to get hold of what terrorism is that is commonly accepted, and that's why we have this distinct difference of opinion on various groups who are classified as terrorism in some countries, but are not classified as terrorism in other countries. And this is not going into the vocabulary of it. I know in America they have this issue with the right-wing terrorism that is not defined as right-wing terrorism. That's a whole completely different topic. But I do think that it seems to be a subjective issue from just observing the narratives that we see.
Yeah, just to build on that, I completely agree. I think you expressed it really well. There's no question that internationally, especially when you look at politicians, political leaders, they tend to define terrorism very subjectively. It's a means of discrediting dissidents and building up support to snuff them out, often violently. And so for that reason, not only is there no consensus over the definition of terrorism, but I think it's safe to say that there will never be a consensus, because leaders have different enemies or perceived enemies. And so they're going to attach the term differently depending on their threats. That said, even though there's no consensus internationally, especially among political leaders, academics, especially social scientists in the United States and in Europe, usually other areas of North America and Australia, academics tend to have a standardized definition where there's less wiggle room. It tends to consist of three parts. First, we're talking about a non-state actor. So we're not talking about governments. We're talking about an individual, often called a lone wolf, or a small cell or a larger organization, who uses violence against a civilian target. So we're not talking about, blowing the treads off of a tank. We're talking about, blowing up markets and cafes and things for some sort of a political goal, whatever that political goal may be. So there's no consensus over this either. But among academics, certainly, my colleagues who study terrorism, we do tend to be pretty much on the same page. And that's really useful because one of the main things that we're trying to do is to predict terrorism, to make predictions about it. And if we don't have a shared understanding of what we're talking about, then our predictions will be meaningless.